modern superheroes.
Imagine a world where those sworn to protect are the ones who instill the most fear, where loyalty to a powerful agency comes at the cost of innocence and freedom. This is Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB, a shadowed institution with immense power, both feared and revered. At its heart is Pavel Belomestnik, a man who dared to expose the truth. Pavel once believed in the agency's mission, entering its ranks with pride and a profound sense of duty. But as he witnessed the FSB's unchecked power firsthand, he discovered a darker reality, one of manipulation, control, and a ruthless silencing of anyone deemed a threat. Today, we bring you the story of one man's journey from patriotism to rebellion, and his dangerous decision to shine a light on the FSB's hidden face. To understand Pavel's journey, it's essential to understand the FSB itself, a modern institution with roots stretching back to the Soviet Union's KGB, an entity that defined a culture of secrecy, control, and intense loyalty. Formed in the early 1990s, the FSB emerged from the remnants of the KGB, stepping into its role as the country's central intelligence and security agency. Initially, its mission was straightforward: maintain internal security and protect Russia from external threats. But in the decades that followed, this mandate expanded far beyond its original scope, turning the FSB into an all-encompassing power with influence over nearly every facet of Russian society. Today, the FSB's reach is nearly absolute. The agency's authority isn't limited to national security or intelligence alone. It extends into areas of law enforcement, business leaders, politicians, community organizers, and even ordinary citizens feel the FSB's invisible presence, a constant reminder that they're never far from the agency's watchful gaze. Many know someone who has been visited by the FSB, warned about their associations, or discouraged from speaking out. Yet the agency's influence often goes unspoken, understood by all, but acknowledged by few. The FSB operates under a veil of secrecy that makes it virtually untouchable. Public trust is maintained through a carefully crafted narrative of national security, a belief that the FSB's work keeps Russia stable and safe. But behind closed doors, it's a different story. Those who know its inner workings describe a world of constant surveillance, where the smallest sign of dissent can lead to harassment, false accusations, or even disappearances that are never explained. This is an agency where loyalty is enforced, not earned. Questioning orders is seen as betrayal, and obedience is absolute. Pavel Belomestnik entered the FSB with a clear sense of purpose and duty, believing he would be defending his country against real threats. But what he didn't realize was how quickly his ideals would be tested. The more he saw, the more he began to understand the agency's true role, a force not solely dedicated to national protection, but to control over the Russian people. This wasn't just an institution. It was a machine designed to ensure compliance, where silence was safety and loyalty often meant complicity. Pavel's first assignment seemed routine, the kind of work he had expected when he joined the FSB. His orders were simple: monitor persons of interest, keep track of their movements, document their interactions. These people, political activists, local business owners, and community leaders, were presented as potential threats, individuals the agency claimed were acting against the nation's interests. For a young agent like Pavel, this task seemed necessary, an essential step in defending Russia from hidden dangers. But as the weeks went by, Pavel started noticing patterns that left him unsettled. Many of the people he was tasked with watching didn't appear to be dangerous at all. There was a middle-aged shopkeeper who worked long hours, a schoolteacher who spent weekends with her family, an elderly man whose only regular outing was to the local park. Their lives seemed ordinary, their routines predictable. Despite this, the FSB insisted on extensive monitoring, recording every detail of their lives as though they posed some hidden threat. One assignment in particular stayed with Pavel. He was instructed to shadow a young father who ran a small cafe in a quiet part of town. The man was kind, well-liked by his neighbors, known for giving free coffee to locals who couldn't afford it. Yet, the FSB seemed intent on painting him as a security risk. Pavel followed him for weeks, noting the man's every move, but nothing stood out. No suspicious behavior, no strange associations. And yet, the orders remained unchanged. Continue the surveillance, report anything unusual, no matter how trivial. Another assignment involved a single mother from a minority community. Her profile flagged her as a person of interest, though the reasons were vague. Pavel was directed to document her daily activities, even though her life revolved around work and caring for her children. He couldn't see the threat she supposedly posed, but orders were orders. He carried out his task, though each time he reported back, a small part of him questioned the purpose behind it. These assignments weren't just confusing, they began to feel wrong. Pavel found himself awake at night, turning these cases over in his mind, wondering what he was missing. The people he was observing were not criminals, nor did they appear to have any hidden agendas. Yet the FSB was adamant, treating these individuals as threats simply because of their background, their beliefs, or their associations. The more he saw, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something was deeply amiss. As the months passed, Pavel's doubt grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that the FSB's actions weren't about protecting the country, but controlling the people within it. Each new assignment added another layer to his unease, each case revealing another crack in the agency he had once revered. He tried to push these thoughts aside, telling himself that there were reasons beyond his understanding, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were beginning to take root. As Pavel continued his assignments, the unease within him grew, taking on a sharper edge as he observed the agency's methods. He began to notice a disturbing pattern. The FSB wasn't just monitoring individuals, it was specifically targeting certain communities, often based solely on ethnicity or religious background. What had once seemed like isolated incidents started to form a troubling picture, one that left Pavel questioning the very purpose of his work. One assignment that stayed with him involved a group of immigrants who had recently moved into a quiet neighborhood. They were hard-working families, people who ran small businesses and kept to themselves. Pavel's orders were clear: monitor them closely, document every interaction, and report any unusual activity. On the surface, it seemed like a standard surveillance order, but as Pavel spent time observing them, he couldn't see any reason for concern. They were simply trying to build a life in a new place, with no signs of extremism or illegal activity. Yet, the FSB's approach was relentless. The agency began planting suspicions within the local community, subtly encouraging neighbors to keep a watchful eye on these new residents. Signs went up warning people to report anything unusual. Surveillance cameras appeared on street corners, positioned in ways that left little doubt about whom they were watching. The message was clear: these families were not welcome. Pavel felt a pang of guilt as he realized he was part of an operation meant to marginalize rather than protect, a tactic designed to sow division rather than uncover threats. Another operation brought him face to face with the agency's use of scapegoating. He was instructed to monitor a religious leader from a minority faith group, a man who had been in the community for years, known for his sermons on peace and unity. Yet the FSB saw him as a problematic influence, someone whose reach needed to be curbed. Pavel's orders were chillingly specific: gather any material that could be twisted to frame the leader as an extremist. When nothing incriminating surfaced, he was told to edit conversations, to take words out of context, to create a narrative that aligned with the FSB's intentions. Pavel's discomfort turned to disgust. This wasn't law enforcement, this was fabrication. The agency wasn't searching for real threats, but manufacturing them, manipulating evidence to justify actions against people who didn't fit a certain mold. It became clear that the FSB wasn't just interested in monitoring dissent. It was actively working to suppress specific cultural and religious identities, treating them as risks that needed to be controlled. He also noticed the FSB's tendency to escalate matters within targeted communities, using minor incidents as pretext for heavy-handed measures. A small gathering would be labeled a subversive meeting. A community event would be cast as an unlawful assembly. In one instance, Pavel was ordered to observe a cultural festival in a predominantly ethnic neighborhood. The event was innocent, a celebration of heritage and unity. But the FSB framed it as suspicious, pushing Pavel to report any behavior that could be painted as rebellious. With each new assignment, Pavel felt his faith in the agency erode further. These weren't isolated actions, but part of a systematic approach to maintain control through intimidation and division. The FSB was shaping a narrative that demonized entire communities, turning neighbors against each other, instilling fear and suspicion. To the agency, it wasn't enough to monitor potential threats. They were creating threats out of ordinary lives, branding innocence as dangerous. In time, these orders took a personal toll on Pavel. He found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the faces of those he'd watched suffer under the FSB's gaze. People whose only crime was existing outside the agency's narrow definition of loyalty. He began to wonder if this was the agency's true purpose, not to protect the country, but to enforce a version of it that erased diversity, individuality, and dissent. The seeds of doubt that had once taken root were now growing into a forest of mistrust, casting shadows over everything he'd once believed in. For Pavel, loyalty to the FSB had always been an unquestioned value, a duty he had committed to with his whole being. But now, that loyalty felt like a chain, tightening around him with each new order he received. The agency's expectations were clear: absolute obedience, questioning an assignment, hesitating over an order. These were signs of weakness, of disloyalty. And in the FSB, disloyalty was one of the gravest offenses, punishable by measures Pavel had witnessed firsthand. The pressure was unrelenting. Each time he found himself doubting an order, a subtle reminder would arrive. A look from a superior, a quiet comment in the hallway, or an offhand reminder of what happened to those who failed the agency. Stories circulated among agents about those who had dared to question the FSB's methods, people who had quietly disappeared, their names erased, their existence as if it had never been. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty meant silence, compliance, and the erasure of any personal doubts. Pavel tried to suppress his growing discomfort, convincing himself that perhaps he was missing a larger picture. Maybe there were layers of intelligence, pieces of information he wasn't privy to, that justified the FSB's extreme measures. But these justifications felt increasingly hollow, and with each new assignment, he found it harder to ignore the agency's disturbing methods. He felt trapped in a role that was beginning to define him, each task stripping away another layer of his identity, leaving behind a shell of obedience. Even among his colleagues, there was a palpable sense of caution. Conversations were guarded, laughter stifled, and camaraderie replaced with quiet suspicion. Pavel found himself second-guessing his every move, every word, wondering if his silence conveyed the obedience the FSB demanded, or if he, too, was being watched. The paranoia was insidious, seeping into every part of his life, isolating him even from those he worked beside. He realized that, in the FSB, trust didn't exist, only duty. Only the ironclad expectation to follow orders without question. Pavel's growing sense of entrapment weighed heavily on him. He was bound to a system that rewarded silence and punished conscience. With each task, each report filed, he felt himself slipping further away from the man he had once been. The ideals that had drawn him to the FSB, honor, loyalty, duty, had become twisted, redefined by an agency that expected him to sacrifice his morality in the name of blind allegiance. In quiet moments, alone with his thoughts, Pavel began to wonder if he could continue. The more he followed orders, the more he felt his sense of self fading, replaced by the cold mask of a loyal agent. And deep down, he knew that the FSB's expectations would only grow, demanding more of him until he had nothing left to give. This was no longer a path of service. It was a trap, one that closed in tighter with every step he took. One of Pavel's most unsettling assignments came in the form of a thin, unmarked file. His orders were straightforward yet chilling. Visit a small shop in a quiet neighborhood. Plant incriminating materials in a place where they would be easily discovered, and ensure that the shopkeeper, a man who had lived there peacefully for years, could be tied to extremist activities. The FSB had decided this man was an undesirable, someone who could serve as an example of the agency's supposed vigilance. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was control. The shopkeeper was known in the community for his kindness, a quiet man who worked long hours to provide for his family. He was a father, a husband, someone who had no reason to be on the FSB's radar. But he was from a minority background, and the agency saw him as an easy target, a scapegoat they could use to justify their narrative of fear and threat. Pavel's task was clear: destroy this man's life and his livelihood, all in the name of loyalty. As Pavel entered the shop, he felt a surge of nausea. The shelves were lined with everyday items: groceries, supplies, small trinkets, reminders of the simple life this man led. Pavel's hand tightened around the small, damning booklet he'd been instructed to hide. It was filled with radical messages, carefully selected to frame the shopkeeper as a threat. The idea of planting it here, in this humble, unassuming space, felt like a betrayal of everything Pavel once believed the FSB stood for. He chose a corner shelf, placing the booklet behind a row of canned goods, ensuring it was partially visible but positioned in a way that suggested it had been carelessly stashed. The entire process took only a few seconds, but each movement felt heavy, as though he was sealing the man's fate with every step. His heart pounded as he backed away, torn between the loyalty he owed the agency and the morality he was being forced to abandon. Just as he was about to leave, he heard the creak of a door. The shopkeeper entered, smiling warmly when he recognized Pavel as a regular customer. There was a gentle familiarity in his expression, a look that said, "Thank you for stopping by." And in that single glance, Pavel felt the full weight of what he was doing. Here was a man who trusted him, who saw him as part of the community. Yet, Pavel was about to rip this man's life apart with a few simple, calculated actions. Their eyes met, and Pavel felt a chill run through him. He wanted to say something, to warn the man, to find some way to undo what he'd just done. But words lodged in his throat, trapped by the knowledge that any sign of hesitation could cost him dearly. He forced a tight smile, nodded, and turned to leave, feeling the shopkeeper's gaze linger on him as he walked out. It was a look of trust, perhaps even gratitude, a look that Pavel knew he would never forget. The guilt was immediate, raw, like an open wound that refused to heal. He barely made it down the street before he had to stop, his stomach churning with a mix of shame and self-loathing. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The man would be arrested, his life torn apart on the flimsiest of pretenses, a casualty of an agency that thrived on creating enemies where none existed. In the days that followed, Pavel's shame deepened as he watched the consequences unfold. The shopkeeper was taken into custody, his business shuttered, his family left in shambles. Neighbors whispered about his radical ties, unaware that they were repeating the very lies the FSB had engineered. The agency praised the success of the operation, another supposed threat neutralized, another community reminded of the FSB's omnipresent control. But for Pavel, this victory felt hollow. This was not justice, nor was it protection. It was manipulation, the calculated destruction of an innocent man for the sake of control and fear. Pavel knew he was complicit, an instrument of a system that saw people as pawns to be used and discarded. That single encounter with the shopkeeper, his warmth, his innocence, his unspoken trust, haunted Pavel, becoming a turning point he couldn't ignore. Each night, as he lay awake, he saw the shopkeeper's face, the quiet trust in his eyes that Pavel had betrayed. The guilt was unyielding, a reminder of the moral lines he had crossed in the name of obedience. And in those silent hours, Pavel began to question if he could continue, if he could keep following orders that tore at his soul. The seeds of doubt that had taken root were now fully grown, filling him with a disquiet that refused to be silenced. Pavel realized then that he couldn't remain silent forever. Something had to change. And as he stared into the darkness, haunted by the shopkeeper's betrayed gaze, he began to consider the impossible, breaking away from the FSB, defying the agency he had once sworn to serve. As Pavel continued his work, his understanding of the FSB's true nature began to evolve. What he once saw as isolated misconduct slowly revealed itself as a web of corruption, intricately woven through the highest levels of leadership. His growing disillusionment was no longer a vague discomfort. It was becoming a visceral sense of betrayal, a feeling that grew with each new glimpse into the agency's darker side. One of the first clear signs came during a meeting with a superior officer who casually mentioned a local business owner as troublesome. The man had refused to cooperate with the FSB's demands, standing his ground against their unwelcome interference. Pavel's superior shrugged, suggesting that a little persuasion would do the trick. Soon after, Pavel discovered what this meant, a series of random inspections, each one an attempt to financially squeeze the business. The FSB agents sent to investigate knew their orders well. They were to find violations, however minor, that could be used to shut the business down unless the owner paid a substantial protection fee. It was a modern form of extortion, carried out under the guise of national security. Pavel felt his stomach twist as he saw firsthand how the FSB preyed upon these people. They weren't safeguarding the public. They were using their authority to line their own pockets. The money collected from these protection fees often vanished, redirected not into agency resources but into the private accounts of higher-ranking officials. Pavel realized that this system of bribes and threats was far more than a few corrupt officers. It was an organized scheme with the approval, even the encouragement, of the agency's leadership. One incident involved a prominent community figure, a man known for his charity work and dedication to uplifting his neighborhood. The FSB considered him influential and, therefore, a threat. Pavel was ordered to observe the man, hoping to find leverage that could be used to control him. When no incriminating evidence surfaced, Pavel's superiors took a different approach. They approached the man with an offer, suggesting that he could avoid trouble by supporting the FSB's agenda. In exchange, he would be allowed to operate his charitable projects without interference. But refusal would mean a swift end to his work, fabricated charges, and a tarnished reputation. Pavel watched this unfold, torn between horror and frustration. This wasn't protection or surveillance. It was manipulation. The agency was enforcing loyalty, not by gaining trust, but through coercion. Anyone who resisted was quietly dealt with, silenced by threats that left no room for defiance. And the officers responsible were rewarded, receiving promotions or bonuses for their dedication to the agent's cause. The corruption wasn't confined to businesses or influential individuals. Pavel learned that entire communities were exploited. In some cases, local leaders were forced to act as informants, providing information on their own neighbors in exchange for protection from false accusations. These leaders were left with no choice, trapped in a moral quandary as they balanced their loyalty to their communities with threats from the FSB. Pavel heard stories of local officials, even school principals, blackmailed into silence, terrified of losing their livelihoods if they failed to cooperate. The more Pavel observed, the more he realized that the agency's quest for control extended far beyond national security. The FSB was a power unto itself, above the law, using its reach to maintain a stranglehold over the country's people. Pavel had entered the agency with the belief that he would be serving a noble cause. But now, as he saw the levels of corruption embedded within the leadership, he felt like a pawn in a much darker game. The agency's leaders were not champions of justice, they were opportunists, prioritizing their own gain over the well-being of the very people they claimed to protect. This realization shook Pavel to his core. He was beginning to understand the FSB's real priorities, and they had nothing to do with the country's safety. Instead, they were about power, acquiring it, enforcing it, and expanding it. His faith in the agency, in the loyalty he had once held so dear, was eroding with every revelation. The ideals that had driven him to join the FSB were now distant memories, replaced by the grim understanding that the agency he served had become a machine of corruption and fear. For Pavel, this was more than just disappointment. It was betrayal. The men he had respected, the leaders he had trusted, were not interested in justice. They were interested in dominance, in consolidating power through greed and fear. And with every new operation, Pavel's anger grew, fed by the knowledge that he was a cog in this corrupted machine. He had sworn to protect his country, but now he realized he was serving those who only wanted to exploit it. Each encounter with the FSB's corruption left a mark on him, deepening the cracks in his loyalty. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a few bad actors. It was a system, one that thrived on silence and obedience. And Pavel was beginning to understand that his silence could no longer be guaranteed. As Pavel deeper into his assignments, he began to see a darker side of the FSB's operations, a campaign that went beyond surveillance and control. The agency wasn't just targeting individuals, it was systematically singling out entire communities, often ethnic or religious minorities, under the guise of national security. Pavel's unease grew as he realized that the FSB's true purpose wasn't just about catching criminals or preventing unrest. It was about reinforcing a vision of society that left no room for diversity or dissent. One of Pavel's assignments focused on a vibrant neighborhood known for its cultural diversity. The area was home to immigrant families, small business owners, and community leaders who had worked tirelessly to create a sense of belonging in a new land. Pavel was ordered to monitor local gatherings, cultural events, and religious practices. The FSB claimed that these gatherings were a breeding ground for extremism, though Pavel saw only families celebrating their heritage, parents teaching children their traditions, and neighbors supporting one another. But the FSB had other plans. Agents would attend these events undercover, subtly stirring up tensions, spreading rumors among locals, and planting seeds of doubt. A simple festival celebrating ethnic heritage was branded as a foreign influence, a threat to national stability. Suddenly, community leaders were summoned for questioning, businesses were inspected without warning, and entire families were placed under surveillance. Pavel watched, torn between duty and morality, as the FSB transformed innocent celebrations into manufactured threats. In another assignment, Pavel was tasked with targeting a religious leader in an ethnic neighborhood, a man who had spent decades advocating for peace and unity within his community. The FSB claimed that his influence was dangerous and that his sermons were coded messages inciting radical thought. Pavel found himself recording the man's speeches, searching for any phrase or word that could be twisted into evidence. But the sermons were filled with messages of hope and harmony, urging his followers to live peacefully, respect the law, and contribute positively to society. When no incriminating evidence surfaced, a different strategy. Pavel's orders shifted from observation to action. He was instructed to plant extremist literature in the leader's office, to ensure that an anonymous tip would lead to a search. The religious leader was soon taken into custody, his reputation in shambles, his life's work destroyed. Pavel felt a profound sense of betrayal. He had become a tool in a calculated campaign of false accusations, a pawn in the FSB's relentless push to instill fear in those who dared to preserve their heritage and faith. Another operation targeted a family who had lived in Russia for generations. They were shop owners, well known in their neighborhood, with deep roots in the community. But the FSB saw them differently. They were from a minority group, and their very existence was deemed a risk. Pavel's orders were chillingly clear: fabricate a connection to foreign extremists, create a case that would justify their deportation. He planted fake documents, invented correspondence, and wove a narrative that painted the family as conspirators. The family was detained, their shop closed down, their lives shattered in a matter of days. Friends and neighbors were warned to avoid association. Whispers of extremism circulating as if the family's heritage alone was enough to justify their condemnation. Pavel felt a surge of guilt each time he passed their empty store, a symbol of the agency's reach and the destruction it wielded. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. This was more than surveillance. It was a campaign against entire communities, an effort to erase cultures the FSB had deemed incompatible with its vision of loyalty. The FSB's methods were ruthless, exploiting cultural and religious differences to enforce obedience. Minority communities became easy targets, trapped in a cycle of intimidation, isolation, and, ultimately, forced removal. Deportation orders were signed under the pretense of security, but Pavel knew the real purpose. The FSB wanted a homogeneous society, one where only certain voices were heard and others were suppressed, where diversity was labeled as dangerous. Pavel's discomfort grew into disgust. This wasn't protection, it was persecution. It was persecution, an attempt to cleanse society of anyone who didn't fit the agency's narrow standards. He saw the despair in the eyes of those he'd been ordered to intimidate, families torn apart under fabricated allegations, communities living in fear of being the next target. And each time he followed an order, each time he fabricated evidence, he felt a part of himself eroding, his sense of duty transforming into a profound sense of guilt. These experiences left a lasting impact on Pavel. The FSB had shown him its true colors, an organization less interested in justice and more focused on control, willing to exploit cultural identities and religious practices to maintain power. He felt trapped, but he also knew that his silence could no longer be assured. His loyalty was fading, replaced by a burning question. How many more lives would be destroyed in the name of this twisted vision of security? With each assignment, Pavel felt his sense of self slipping away, replaced by a growing weight of guilt and shame. At night, alone with his thoughts, he was haunted by the faces of those he'd helped wrong, innocents, whose lives were shattered because of his loyalty to the FSB. This once proud loyalty now felt like a burden, chaining him to actions that left him questioning everything he stood for. The guilt was relentless, seeping into every part of his life. His sleep was fractured, filled with nightmares of those he'd betrayed. Faces flashed before him, innocent families, devastated communities, accusing him, reminding him of the harm he had caused. Each morning, he awoke feeling drained, barely able to recognize himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him was a stranger, someone who had abandoned his ideals in the name of a purpose that now felt hollow. His physical state began to reflect his inner turmoil. The tension showed on his face, his sleepless nights leaving dark circles under his eyes. He withdrew, becoming guarded, knowing that in the FSB, even a hint of doubt could be dangerous. He had seen colleagues disappear for less, removed without explanation. Their absences a silent reminder of the cost of hesitation. As his discomfort grew, so did his questions. He began to realize that his assignments weren't about justice or protection. They were about enforcing a vision of control, shaping society to fit the agency's ideals. His patriotism had once fueled his work, but now he saw it for what it was, a convenient excuse for the FSB's unyielding pursuit of power. The orders he followed weren't protecting the country. They were erasing parts of it, silencing voices, and erasing identities. Alone in his apartment, Pavel grappled with this painful truth. He had joined the FSB to serve his country, but he was coming to see that the agency was more interested in domination than safety. Every order he followed, every innocent life he touched, only deepened his sense of complicity. His silence, once a mark of loyalty, was now a prison, a burden that kept him trapped in a system that thrived on control and fear. In quiet moments of reflection, Pavel allowed himself to imagine a different path, one where he wouldn't have to sacrifice his values. He knew it would take immense courage to break free, to go against the agency that demanded obedience. But as his guilt grew, so did the faint hope of change. Though he wasn't ready to act, he knew he couldn't ignore these thoughts forever. Each day brought him closer to a decision he knew would change everything. The decision didn't come all at once. It was a gradual build-up, a series of sleepless nights and painful realizations that finally solidified into resolve. Pavel couldn't escape the faces of the innocent people whose lives he'd helped ruin. He could feel the weight of his silence, the complicity that bound him to the agency's oppressive agenda. The tipping point came during a quiet night, a moment where he allowed himself to confront the full reality of his role. He was part of a system that manipulated, oppressed, and controlled under the guise of national security. He knew then that he could no longer be complicit. With a deep breath, Pavel began forming a plan. If he was going to stand against the FSB, he needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence of their misconduct. He realized that simply escaping wouldn't be enough. He had to expose the truth. His mission shifted from one of self-preservation to one of accountability, a dangerous path that would require every ounce of caution and resilience he had. First, he mapped out a strategy to access sensitive files without drawing attention. He knew the agency's routines and security measures well, and he used this knowledge to slip into secured areas when he knew he wouldn't be noticed. Late at night, he would carefully comb through documents, selecting files that detailed operations against innocent people, records of fabricated evidence, and orders that clearly exposed the FSB's true intentions. Each document he copied was another piece of the case he was building against the agency. Next, he began secretly recording conversations with his superiors. He would keep a small, concealed device on him, capturing the chilling directives he was given, the cold discussions that reduced human lives to numbers on a report. These recordings were filled with language that left no doubt about the FSB's motivations: a hunger for control, a disregard for justice, a drive to silence dissent. Each conversation documented another facet of the agency's corruption, another piece of the truth he would eventually reveal. Pavel also started documenting specific incidents, carefully recording the details of operations that targeted ethnic communities, fabricated charges, and forced deportations. He knew he needed to be thorough. Every incident, every order followed, had to be meticulously catalogued to build an airtight case. He would write everything down in a hidden journal, storing it alongside the files and recordings, creating a trove of evidence that painted a damning picture of the agency's activities. The plan gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Though the danger was immense, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the first relief he'd felt in months. He knew he was risking his life, but he also knew that he couldn't continue in silence. For Pavel, this wasn't just an escape plan. It was a quest for redemption, a chance to undo some of the harm he had caused. He had been part of the machine, but now he was ready to stand against it, to reveal the FSB's secrets to the world. And as he took his first steps down this dangerous path, Pavel felt a glimmer of hope. He had spent years enforcing a narrative he no longer believed in. Now, he was ready to tell the truth. Once Pavel committed to exposing the FSB, his every action became a careful, deliberate move toward freedom. He knew the agency's reach was vast, and that even the smallest mistake could end his plan before it began. He had to be cautious, methodical, leaving no trace that might lead the FSB back to him or the evidence he'd risked everything to collect. His first priority was to secure the evidence. Carrying it openly would be impossible, and he knew the FSB would search every place he had ever visited once they realized he was gone. Pavel decided to split the documents, recordings, and notes into multiple hidden locations across the city. He chose discreet places that wouldn't attract attention, abandoned buildings, quiet alleys, places he could access quickly in emergencies. Each location held only a portion of the evidence, making it harder for anyone to piece together the full story if they were discovered. Pavel felt a grim satisfaction as he stashed the final files, knowing that he'd taken the first step toward exposing the truth. To buy himself time, Pavel began planting false trails. He used his knowledge of the agency's methods to subtly create a misleading pattern of movement. He would leave traces in far-off locations, quietly dropping hints that he was planning to travel to remote areas, suggesting he was considering fleeing to another country. A few staged conversations, a strategically placed ticket stub, a fabricated internet search on a public computer. Each detail was designed to lead his superiors in the wrong direction, to delay their pursuit just long enough for him to escape. The constant danger added a layer of intensity to his preparations. Every time he returned to the FSB headquarters, he felt the weight of suspicion pressing down on him, as though every gaze held an unspoken question. He kept his head down, maintaining the same obedient demeanor he always had, knowing that even the slightest hint of hesitation could raise alarms. Each interaction felt like a test, a silent assessment of his loyalty that left him walking a razor's edge. At night, he would lie awake, his mind racing through every detail of his plan, searching for weaknesses, vulnerabilities he might have overlooked. The FSB had a way of sensing disloyalty, of detecting even the faintest tremors of dissent. Pavel knew that once he disappeared, they would spare no resources in tracking him down. And as he lay in the dark, he could almost feel their presence closing in around him, a reminder of the agency's relentless grip. Despite the fear, he found strength in his mission. This wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure the FSB's secrets would see the light of day. Each hidden file, each recorded conversation was a step closer to the truth. The danger was immense, but he had come too far to turn back. Every precaution he took, every trail he planted, brought him closer to freedom, closer to breaking free from the agency that had taken so much from him. With his escape plan set and the evidence safely hidden, Pavel was ready to take the next step. The countdown had begun, and he knew there was no turning back. The night Pavel put his escape plan into motion, he was acutely aware that every moment mattered. He had rehearsed each step in his mind countless times, but now the stakes were real. One wrong move, one lapse in judgment, and he would be captured before he even made it out of the city. The weight of his collected evidence pressed down on him, and with it, the realization that he was about to leave everything he had ever known behind. He started by setting up the diversions he'd carefully crafted. Hours before he slipped away, he left a planted trail that would lead his pursuers in the wrong direction. He made sure to use a series of anonymous phone calls and left a note in his apartment that hinted at an urgent business trip to a remote area. He needed the FSB to think he was still operating under their radar, to delay their reaction just long enough to give him a head start. Each piece of false evidence was a small yet crucial part of his plan, calculated to buy him a few precious hours. Slipping out of the city under the cover of night, Pavel avoided all the usual exits. He took back alleys, used unmonitored streets, and dressed inconspicuously to blend into the late-night crowd. In his bag were only the essentials: cash, fake identification, a burner phone, and a few remaining documents he couldn't risk leaving behind. As he walked, every sound felt amplified, every passing face seemed a potential threat, as though the FSB's reach could materialize at any moment. Pavel's first destination was a safe house he had secured weeks in advance. A place outside the city that would allow him to gather his thoughts and make contact with allies who could help him leave the country. He traveled there under a false name, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of surveillance. Once inside, he breathed a sigh of relief, but knew he couldn't stay long. The FSB would soon realize he was missing, and he had to put as much distance between himself and Moscow as possible. The border crossing was his next and most dangerous hurdle. He had chosen a lesser-known checkpoint, one where security was lax but still unpredictable. The FSB was known for its tight border controls, and Pavel knew he couldn't rely on his fake identification alone. As he approached, he kept his head down, his posture deliberately relaxed, as if he were just another traveler. Every moment felt stretched, the wait agonizingly slow as his documents were inspected. But luck was on his side, and he was waved through, his heart pounding as he crossed the invisible line of safety. Once across the border, Pavel knew he still couldn't rest. The FSB's network extended beyond Russia's boundaries, and he was certain they would issue an alert the moment his absence was confirmed. Using a contact he'd cultivated in a neighboring country, he arranged for temporary shelter, a place to stay hidden while he coordinated his next steps. Each night he changed locations, staying in hostels and inconspicuous rooms, constantly altering his appearance to avoid detection. As he moved through unfamiliar cities, Pavel relied on a network of allies, journalists, activists, and former colleagues who understood the stakes of his mission. These people provided him with shelter, resources, and, perhaps most importantly, a sense of solidarity that strengthened his resolve. Each night, he communicated carefully, ensuring his messages were encrypted, his locations untraceable. The FSB was relentless, but he had prepared for this, creating a system of misdirection that allowed him to stay one step ahead. Pavel's life became a series of careful, calculated moves, each one designed to keep him invisible. He avoided technology, left no digital footprint, and traveled only through channels that minimized the chance of being recognized. The FSB had eyes everywhere, but Pavel knew that every day he stayed free brought him closer to his goal, finding a way to release the evidence he had risked so much to gather. As he crossed into safer territory, a sense of liberation washed over him. The fear was still there, a constant reminder of the FSB's reach, but for the first time in years, Pavel felt a spark of hope. He had managed to escape, to outwit the very agency that had once been his entire life. And though he was still a fugitive, hunted and alone, he knew he had taken the first true step toward freedom, and toward revealing the truth the FSB so desperately wanted to hide. Life on the run was a relentless test of Pavel's endurance and mental strength. Each day felt like a tightrope walk, a delicate balance between survival and discovery. He knew the FSB's reach was vast, extending into countries far beyond Russia's borders, and every town, every city he passed through held the threat of being recognized. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. His safety depended on anonymity, on blending in, on becoming invisible. Pavel adopted new identities like a second skin, changing his appearance as often as he changed locations. He would trim his beard, alter his hairstyle, wear glasses one day and go without the next. His clothes were plain, unremarkable, each outfit chosen to avoid attracting even a passing glance. The constant shifting was exhausting, each change reminding him that his life could never be stable, that he was always one step away from danger. Every day began with a scan of his surroundings. Pavel developed a habit of watching the people around him, assessing who could pose a threat, who might be watching him too closely. He studied every room he entered, his mind mapping exits, calculating escape routes. This vigilance was both a shield and a prison, isolating him from those around him. Conversations were brief, guarded, and he was careful to keep his face expressionless, his responses vague, leaving no trace of his true identity. The psychological toll was immense. Each night, Pavel lay in bed, listening to every creak, every murmur, his mind racing through escape scenarios. He would wake at the slightest sound, his heart pounding, visions of FSB agents bursting through the door playing like a horror film in his mind. The constant state of alertness wore him down, and he found himself haunted by nightmares of capture, of being dragged back into the agent's grasp. Even in sleep, he was never truly free. The loneliness was just as brutal. Cut off from family, from friends, from anything familiar, Pavel existed in a world of strangers. He had no one to share his fears with, no one to lighten the crushing weight of his isolation. He could never form connections, never let his guard down, because any bond could become a weakness the FSB might exploit. The people who helped him, a network of activists, journalists, and sympathizers, were kind, but he could only stay with them briefly, always moving, always leaving before the bond grew too strong. Food became a necessity rather than a pleasure, something to sustain him rather than to enjoy. He ate quickly, often choosing cheap, inconspicuous meals from local vendors. He rarely sat in one place for long, even while eating, and he would choose spots with clear views of entrances and exits, his back always against a wall. The paranoia was unrelenting, an invisible chain that dictated his every move, every choice, every thought. The physical toll soon matched the mental. Pavel's body began to show signs of the stress, dark circles under his eyes, a constant ache in his muscles, the weight loss from nights of restless sleep and hurried meals. He moved with a deliberate caution that had become second nature, his shoulders always tense, his mind prepared for flight. He knew he could never allow himself to relax, even for a moment. The FSB's network was vast, and he was constantly aware of their determination to find him. Yet, in his quietest moments, Pavel clung to a sliver of hope. He reminded himself why he had risked everything, why he endured the endless days of solitude and fear. The evidence he carried was his purpose, the reason he kept going despite the darkness closing in around him. He knew that if he could survive long enough, if he could evade the FSB just a little longer, he might find a way to share the truth he'd uncovered, to make his story a weapon against the agency he once served. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Pavel felt the edges of his resolve begin to fray. The life he led was grueling, and every passing day was a reminder of what he had sacrificed. Still, he pressed on, steeling himself with the knowledge that his suffering had a purpose. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was a witness, a survivor, and perhaps in time he would become the voice that exposed the FSB's darkest secrets to the world. After months of isolation and constant vigilance, Pavel reached a point where he knew he couldn't keep running forever. His evidence, files, recordings, and notes detailing the FSB's darkest operations was meant for more than just survival. He hadn't risked everything to keep these secrets hidden. If he wanted to make a real impact, he needed to share the truth. And so, he made the difficult decision to reach out to journalists he could trust, individuals who wouldn't be swayed by threats or manipulation. The decision weighed heavily on him. He knew that once he shared the evidence, he would be in greater danger than ever before. The FSB would stop at nothing to silence him, and the risk of exposure would skyrocket. But as he reviewed the files and recordings in his possession, Pavel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a fugitive. He was now a voice for those who had suffered at the FSB's hands, and he was determined to make sure that story was told. The process of reaching out was painstakingly slow. Pavel carefully researched journalists with reputations for integrity and courage, reporters who had a history of exposing uncomfortable truths. His first contacts were cautious, cryptic messages sent through encrypted channels, giving only enough information to capture their interest without revealing his identity. Each interaction was a delicate balance of sharing enough to build trust while keeping himself safe. Days passed before he received his first reply, a brief yet hopeful response from a journalist willing to listen. The exchange was tense, each message a test of trust, as both sides assessed the other's intentions. Slowly, Pavel began to reveal more. Details of FSB operations, descriptions of the tactics used to control and manipulate communities, hints at the evidence he held. As he built a relationship with the journalist, Pavel felt a small but profound sense of relief. For the first time, Since he'd left Russia, he wasn't alone in his mission. Someone understood the weight of his story. Finally, the moment came when Pavel shared his full story. The files, the recordings, the proof of the FSB's corruption and abuse. As he sent the final encrypted file, his heart pounded, a mixture of fear and anticipation flooding through him. He knew he was crossing a line he could never return from. The journalist promised confidentiality, assuring him that his identity would be protected. But still, Pavel felt exposed, as though the walls around him had thinned, leaving him vulnerable to the FSB's reach. When the story broke, Pavel watched from afar as headlines spread across news channels, detailing the horrors he had risked his life to uncover. The public was finally seeing the truth about the FSB's tactics, the fabricated charges, the extortion, the targeting of innocent people. He saw images of protests, of people demanding accountability, and knew that his sacrifice had begun to create ripples beyond his reach. But as the story gained traction, so did the danger. The FSB responded quickly, attempting to discredit the evidence, labeling Pavel a disgruntled former agent. The agency dismissed the allegations as fabrications, but the intensity of their reaction only fueled public suspicion. Journalists who covered the story reported receiving veiled threats, a reminder that the FSB's influence extended far and wide. Still, the story continued to spread, reaching readers and viewers across the world. For Pavel, the experience was bittersweet. He felt a sense of validation, a relief in knowing that he'd fulfilled his mission. But he also knew that his life as he'd known it was over. There would be no safe haven, no rest, no return to the life he'd once led. Yet, in the midst of this sacrifice, he felt a sense of redemption. He had found a way to make his story matter, to ensure that the FSB's secrets would never again be hidden behind closed doors. The truth was out, and for Pavel, that was enough. The story hit the public like a thunderclap. As news channels ran headline after headline detailing Pavel's revelations, the shock rippled far and wide. The FSB, a symbol of power and control in Russia, was being exposed for its hidden agenda, its manipulation, and its ruthless tactics. Citizens who had lived in silent fear for years now had confirmation of what they had always suspected, and those who had once trusted the agency were forced to confront a darker reality. The media was relentless. Journalists dove into Pavel's evidence, piecing together a narrative that painted a grim picture of the FSB's inner workings. News anchors dissected the documents and recordings outlining the FSB's operations with a clarity that left viewers both horrified and angry. For the first time, the agency's grip on the country was being questioned openly, its methods scrutinized by a population that had, until now, been kept in the dark. Public outcry was swift. People took to the streets in protest, holding signs that demanded justice for those targeted by the FSB's fabricated charges and forced deportations. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, chanting for accountability and holding up images of families torn apart by the agency's operations. The FSB, once an untouchable force, now faced a backlash it had never anticipated. Pavel's story became a rallying cry, a call for change that resonated with people across the country. The impact wasn't limited to the streets. Online forums, social media, and international news outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach far beyond Russia's borders. Human rights organizations released statements condemning the FSB's actions, and foreign governments expressed concern over the agency's abuses. Pavel's evidence was now a global topic, a source of scrutiny that placed the FSB under an unprecedented spotlight. But as the world reacted, the FSB moved to contain the fallout. The agency's leaders quickly issued statements, dismissing the revelations as the lies of a disgruntled former employee. They claimed the evidence was fabricated, an attempt to destabilize the nation. But the intensity of their denial only fueled suspicion, and the public began to see through the agency's attempts to silence the truth. The FSB's retaliation went beyond words. Pavel knew that the agency would spare no effort to track him down, and that anyone connected to the story would be at risk. Journalists who covered the revelations reported harassment, their families receiving veiled threats. The FSB issued warnings, hinting at legal repercussions for anyone who continued to discuss the allegations. Those closest to the investigation were followed, questioned, and in some cases, detained briefly. A chilling reminder that the agency's reach was as vast as ever. For Pavel, the backlash was deeply personal. He had known the risks when he decided to go public, understood that the FSB would come after him with everything they had. But seeing the agency's brutal response, watching them attempt to silence journalists and intimidate supporters, it was a reminder of the very power he had set out to challenge. He had traded his safety for the truth, and now he was facing the full force of an agency determined to protect itself. And yet, Despite the threats, despite the FSB's relentless pursuit, Pavel felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth was out there and people were listening. The agency could deny, intimidate, and retaliate, but the evidence was public and the world was watching. He had ignited something powerful, a movement that the FSB couldn't entirely control. And though his life was now marked by isolation and danger, he felt a sense of validation, a belief that his sacrifices had been worth it. Pavel knew the fight wasn't over, that the FSB would continue its efforts to discredit him and suppress the truth. But he also knew that his story had become bigger than himself, that it had touched lives, sparked conversations, and forced people to confront the reality of the agency's actions. For the first time since he'd left Russia, Pavel felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that, perhaps, he had made a difference. In the quiet moments far from the crowds, the protests, and the headlines, Pavel often found himself reflecting on the life he had left behind. He was now a man without a home, without family or friends, and without the country he had once served. His existence was one of constant movement, an endless routine of watching his back, of looking over his shoulder for the agency that would always be hunting him. Yet, despite the loneliness and the fear that shadowed him, Pavel felt an undeniable sense of peace. The decision to expose the FSB's secrets had come at a staggering cost. His life, once defined by loyalty and service, was now marked by exile, by a silent war against a powerful enemy. The people he had once trusted, the colleagues he had shared his life with, were now distant memories, reminders of a past he could never return to. He would forever be an outsider, living in the shadows, his identity hidden to protect those he had left behind. But even with all he had lost, he knew he had made the right choice. As he looked back, Pavel felt a deep sense of redemption. He had once been part of the very machine he had now exposed, complicit in its crimes, a silent witness to its cruelty. But he had broken free, had chosen to face the darkness within the FSB, to confront the very agency that had defined him. In doing so, he had reclaimed his own humanity, his sense of purpose. He was no longer just a pawn in the agency's game. He had become a voice for those who could not speak, a witness to the suffering the FSB had inflicted. Though his actions had come with a price, Pavel felt a weight lift from his shoulders each time he saw the impact of his story. The FSB, once unchallenged, was now under scrutiny. People who had lived in fear for years were now finding the courage to speak out, to question, to demand change. His revelations had sparked a movement, a call for justice that was spreading beyond his reach. Pavel took comfort in the knowledge that his sacrifice had meaning, that the truth he had fought to share was now making a difference. Still, the journey wasn't easy. There were days when he questioned if he could keep going, if the loneliness and constant threat of capture were too much to bear. But in those moments, he reminded himself of why he had taken this path. He thought of the families he had saved, the lives he had protected by refusing to remain silent. His story, his sacrifice, was now part of a larger battle for justice, a fight he hoped would one day bring real change. And so, as he continued his life on the run, Pavel carried with him a quiet hope, a belief that the world was beginning to understand the dangers of unchecked power, that people were waking up to the realities he had exposed. He had traded his life for the truth, and though he would forever be hunted, forever isolated, he was at peace with his decision. His journey had shown him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. In his heart, Pavel knew he would never see the end of the struggle he had ignited. But he also knew that his actions had started something, a movement that could no longer be contained. He was just one man, but he had shown that even a single voice could shake the foundations of power. And as he faded into the shadows, leaving behind the life he had once known, Pavel felt a sense of freedom he had never known before. The freedom of a man who had chosen truth over silence, integrity over fear. Pavel Belomesnik's story is a testament to courage, the courage to stand against an institution that seemed untouchable, to risk everything in the name of truth and justice. He chose to break free from a system that thrived on fear and control, to expose the darkness lurking within the agency he once served. His journey reminds us of the extraordinary strength it takes to confront corruption, especially when doing so means leaving behind everything familiar and stepping into a world of uncertainty and danger. But Pavel's story is more than just a glimpse into the FSB's inner workings. It's a call to each of us to recognize the value of truth and accountability, to understand that unchecked power can lead to unimaginable suffering. Pavel showed us that even one voice can challenge the powerful, that one person's determination can bring secrets into the light. As you reflect on his journey, consider the countless others around the world who face similar battles, people who risk their lives to reveal injustices and expose hidden truths. They need our support, our attention, and our commitment to holding those in power accountable. Stay informed, raise your voice, and stand with those who fight for transparency and human rights. Because in the end, the strength of a society is measured not by the power it wields, but by the courage of those who stand up against it in the name of justice. Together, we can ensure that voices like Pavel's are not silenced, and that the truth, no matter how dangerous, always finds its way into the light.